Great. Well, welcome everyone. This is the climate series. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Maarten Hajer to speak about the captured future of climate politics, along with respondent Professor Sybil Seitzinger, who's joining us from the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. I'm Vanessa Timmer. I'm the Executive Director of One Earth. And the climate series is actually produced by CANS Vancouver, which is the Dutch Cultural Association here in British Columbia, where I serve as a board member. And the series is co-presented and actually supported by the Consulate General of the Netherlands in Vancouver, and co-presented with my nonprofit One Earth and the Wild Bird Trust of British Columbia. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we're hosting this webinar from Vancouver, from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish Indigenous peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And this acknowledgement is a recognition of the discriminatory and unjust practices of the past, and to thank the First Nations for their care of this land historically and today, and our partnerships with them and their wisdom. They're really leading the way in terms of solutions. And so we are very grateful for those that working in parallel with them and together with them. So at this moment, I'd like to welcome you to please share in the chat your name, your location, and why you joined this webinar, what you're curious about, and you'll see other people's reflections coming in as well. And we welcome you to use the chat throughout this webinar to ask questions and to make comments. And really, this is a chance for us to kind of connect with each other and communicate with each other. It's also where I'll be looking for the question and answer period. And you can also just put your own resources into the chat as well. So we're recording this webinar for sharing on the CANS Vancouver YouTube channel. And some of you were here for the first event of the climate series, in which I presented in November on the role of people in climate action and the process and outcomes of the COP26, or Conference of the Parties for the Climate Summit. So we're continuing this climate series from today, from November all the way to Earth Day on April 22nd. And our goal is to highlight Dutch perspectives on tackling the climate emergency. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Maarten Hajer, but first I want to introduce the Consul General of the Netherlands to Canada based in Vancouver, Henk Snoeken. And Henk, you're very familiar with the politics of, well, not only climate change, but generally in Dutch politics, having previously served as the Deputy Director of International Affairs and earlier the Deputy Director of Spatial Development at the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment. You know Professor Maarten Hajer, you know Sybil, who we were hearing from. So I would want to welcome you to say some opening remarks about your perspective, what's happening in the Netherlands right now, and also your understanding of perhaps some ideas around its climate policy. So over to you, Henk.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning to all. Thank you for having me here. Especially good morning also to the esteemed speakers of this meeting. Happy to see Maarten live again, unfortunately on a screen, but he's there, and good to meet Professor Seitzinger in Victoria. First of all, let me thank you. Let me thank the volunteers and all the people who are working in the organization CANS. We thank you very much for being such a thriving force in the Dutch community here in British Columbia. It's great that you're doing these kind of things, and we wish you a lot of success in the next year. Hopefully, sometimes also live and meeting people. But of course, these kind of meetings are great, and especially for those who have a kind of feet in the Dutch Reformed Church at 11 on a Sunday morning talking about climate policy in BC has for me a very special aspect. Great initiative. A few words. Why are we sponsoring this climate series of CANS? Well, climate policy, it was also acknowledged by our government, is one of the major problems of the world at this moment. And it's great that we can also talk in our Dutch community about climate policy, and how do you work as individuals on this policy? And I also see a lot of like-mindedness between Canada and the Netherlands in the fields of climate, and also in their orientation on cooperation at a global level in the fields of climate, which you cannot say of all the countries in the world at this moment. So it's great to do that in this country. Cherishing the friendship between Canada and the Netherlands. Climate is one of the major challenges at this moment. We experienced it so closely last year here in British Columbia. All of you know or have seen or have experienced the fires, the storms. For me, it was the first time that I heard the word this word about the special storms, the Pacific storms that were coming up, the floodings in the Fraser Valley, the snow that was higher than for a long time here in BC. By the way, when we're talking about the floodings, know that we from the Dutch government have shortly after the problems rose in the Fraser Valley and the interior because of the floodings, we've offered support to Premier Horgan, Minister Calon and Roxton to help them in the rebuilding of the area, especially when it comes to diking and things like that. And we're in close contact with BC government about that now. So we do not only want to talk about climate, but it's also about concrete initiatives. A few words about climate policy in the Netherlands at the moment. Of course, I'm a government official, so I will be very officially presenting the policy that is done. And in a certain way, it's a great moment. We have in the cabinet, it took a little bit of time before there came a cabinet. For the first time in a Dutch cabinet, a minister of climate, and not at least one, a young, new, bright politician coming up in the Netherlands, an influential man in The Hague, and a broad policy. And when you look at the coalition agreement, you see that climate is seen as, let's say, the major and first priority in government policy. Huge investments are foreseen. There's a climate fund of about 53 million Canadian dollars brought forward. There's another fund which is in the field of nitrogen, which also brings again another $40 million. And there's a lot of money available to work on climate policy in the next year. One of the big challenges will, of course, be how do you coordinate all the kinds of policies that will be made by this government. The aim is to become climate neutral in 2050. And what the government has said that they want to tighten up the 2030 goal and speed up the energy transition, which is a major challenge in the Netherlands, which is transitioning from a natural gas country to a more renewable energy country. One of the things is that climate policy is also very much tied to other main policy domains in the Netherlands, which can be a kind of an advantage in bringing it forward, but which can make it also a challenge to bring all these things together. I told before the subject of nitrogen, which is a major problem in the Dutch agriculture at the moment. How do we diminish the deposition of nitrogen of agriculture will be a fierce object of Dutch cabinet, and it's closely related to the climate policy. There's has to be a transitioning of, there has to be a lot of emphasis on electrification of transport and diminishing the GHG emissions of all other kinds of transport also, which could have and which leads to discussions, for example, on the position of Schiphol Airport. But there's sheer emphasis in the cabinet agreement that we have to work on those kind of things. There's, as I said, a lot of attention for a more sustainable agriculture. One of the challenges that we will also see in the near future is how do you organize the heating of all our houses in the Netherlands, transitioning from a natural gas-based country that produces its own gas to a completely other energy-driven country. Well, there's a lot to be done. The new minister said, I'm more than happy that more and more folks want to speed up, and we will ensure that everyone can do their part and that no one is left behind. Let's do our part here in BC this morning now by listening to Maarten Hajer and Sybil Seitzinger. There's a lot to be learned.
Great. Thank you so much, Henk. Yes, it's so interesting also to hear not only are the Canadian and Dutch kind of walking step by step in terms of like-mindedness, there's also support, as you say, during the flooding and other times you can really learn from each other. And interesting to hear also about the financial investments, the shifts in the cabinet, including some new young blood and the kinds of priorities happening in terms of being climate neutral by 2050, housing, nitrogen, transport, sustainable agriculture. So as you say, lots to explore. And I think what'll be really interesting to hear from Maarten Hajer is how do we actually even think about those challenges and how do we actually tackle them in terms of the politics behind them, in terms of making that transition. So thank you so much, Henk, and also for the support of the Consulate General for this series. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Maarten Hajer. Professor Maarten Hajer, I know from collaborating with him at Utrecht University and beyond. He's a Dutch political scientist and regional planner. He's a faculty professor of urban futures at Utrecht University, and he leads the Urban Future Studio, which I'm also a fellow of, and that looks at how we imagine the future in cities and beyond. Maarten's a member of the International Resources Panel, and he co-leads the work on cities there. And he's also the former Director General of the Netherlands Environmental Protection Agency, the PBL, which he led from 2008 to 2015. Now, Maarten, the floor is yours to talk with us about the politics of this, how we get to these kind of big aspirations that Henk was speaking about, and particularly the captured future of climate politics. Over to you, Maarten.
Thank you, Vanessa, and fantastic that you're all here on a Sunday morning, Sunday evening for those who are in Europe. And it's nice to follow up on Henk, whose collegial work I enjoyed very much when I was a member of the government as leading the PBL research agency. However, today I will speak primarily really as an independent academic and more in particular as a concerned political scientist. So I want to apply political science knowledge and a particular type of political science that I sort of developed with my group to understanding how we can move on to achieve sustainable world. So the idealism is what I'm aiming at, but I don't want to be engaged in a naive, overly optimistic endeavor to reach sustainability in our futures. So I do that from the context of the Urban Future Studios, a small unit of people around basically my chair. And the work that I will be presenting is something that I really co-produced with Jeroen, who's also in the call. We're working on a book on this topic of captured futures. Now, to start my talk, I want to share with you this image that you're all familiar with, right? It is iconic, and it sort of is there to represent the Paris Agreement on climate change of 2015. Far less attention, but perhaps even deeper in its sort of at least ambitions, are of course the Sustainable Development Goals that were also agreed upon in September of that year, 2015. And these Sustainable Development Goals were sort of an action plan of the United Nations. And I would like to ask Erwin to play a really small clip by Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, who elucidates what that is all about. don't hear sound.
The Sustainable Development Goals are the world's action plan for a fair globalization and a better future for all. We have 10 years to bring that vision to life, and we can only get there together. That is why we have launched a decade of action to deliver the goals, to overcome poverty and inequality, to combat the climate crisis and advance gender equality, to build peaceful, just and inclusive societies free of discrimination and hate in harmony with nature. Join us, step up, seize the moment, and let us work together to meet the goals, move our world forward, and leave no one behind.
Thanks, Erwin. If you can put my sheets back up.
I don't know if I have that capacity.
Okay. This one, okay. So, I don't know how you sort of listen to such a talk by Antonio Guterres, but I mean, it's of course almost too good to be true. A decade of action, in 10 years, we're going to turn things around, overcome poverty and inequality. We live in harmony with nature. We leave no one behind. I mean, who would not agree with these sort of policy goals? Yet, of course, the question is if it is feasible at all to glitches to achieve that, and there I suppose the academy, the environmental scientists, Sybil Seitzinger being a very prominent one amongst them, basically warn the world that time is running out very quickly. There is a limited carbon budget. We've emitted so much carbon already that we really have to dramatically change our way of living, basically. And so there is a very prominent mismatch. I'm having difficulty in changing my slides. There is a apparent mismatch between the goals of the UN and what academics actually present to policymakers. Now, I would like to talk about this in using this idea of a paradox of hope, because having been part of that setting, preparing the science for these conferences of the parties on biodiversity and climate and others, I know this all too well that there is a need for optimism in the circles of policymakers. You can't be a pessimist. I mean, if you're a policymaker, you have to believe that change is possible. You then, however, have to face the fact that you meet academics that deliver knowledge that is often, giving harsh predictions of the future, calling for deep transformative change. The politicians to which policymakers deliver their ideas have to navigate through what I call a corridor of contemporary politics. There's a corridor that restricts the sort of proposals that they can come up with politically. So they have a sort of political feasibility sort of concern. So what happens, and that's my feeling when I listen to Guterres, you end up with implausible policy propositions that basically undercut the credibility of that optimism and the hope, precisely what they seek to radiate and express. So that is why I find these sort of statements not helpful, because they're not based on a proper analysis of the delimitations of the political. And what I wanted to do today is to give you a few tools, share a few tools, and how I use these tools to analyze why I'm unconvinced that we can achieve these results within the given understanding of the political. And then I will conclude with 6 alternative dramaturgies, different ways of approaching politics that I think can restore a sense of hope. But first of all, then, that idea that I, as a political scientist, do not analyze elections and voting behavior, as so many political scientists do. I'm into public policy. And the way in which I analyze that is to take a parallel with the theater. I see politics as theater. And I say there is an implicit dramaturgy, so a theatricality in the political and also in environmental politics. And that is not to be funny or something. No, I think that making good drama helps to create good politics. You have to, after all, in politics, always convince people, and drama can actually help do that. But if you perform in the wrong manner, these performances will fall short, and people will no longer sort of believe you as a politician. So very basic then is what you analyze is who says what, how are things being said, where are they being said, and to whom are things being said. And I won't go into the theory very much more, but let's go back to then politics. So here we see the leaders of the governments coming together in what they call a conference of the parties, and where they, as leaders of these countries, nation states, in unilateral formation, decide on what needs to be done. Here we see somebody else taking to the street, Greta Thunberg, or here we see Extinction Rebellion also taking to the streets because they're concerned that politics will not be able to reach its goals. Now let's go back to the theory for a bit, because we need to deepen what we just saw. And I will do that coining the phrase that the political, how we do politics, matters. You have to appreciate that there is always, there are three concepts in political science that interrelate. So at the top, you see politics, and politics, a very old-fashioned but still current understanding is that politics is about binding allocation of value, so that somehow our political leadership takes decisions on our behalf. That is what politics is about. So they are elected to do so, and if we don't like what they decide, we can elect a different group of politicians in. We do that, the bottom left, in a particular polity, that is the unit where we organize our politics. And that's by and large the nation state. That's 19th century invention, the nation state. And in the UN, you collaborate. And how do you do it? Well, you define policies, sets of instruments that act upon the decisions that have been made. So it's the sphere of legitimate expression of matters of concern. And my concern now is that our politics is captured. It is too much an uneven expression of power. Vested interests have found their way to influence what can be decided upon in the political, and that stands in the way of a proper environmental policy. This is the final bit of theory I want to give you. I think we need to open up that understanding of politics and appreciate that we have to analyze the rules and procedures, how they influence what can be said and who are excluded. And also realize that if there is a fixed notion of the political that's policed, it's not as if it's easy to open that up, not at all. There is active control. And finally, the question is, that's Chantal Mouffe, the woman on the left, arguing for an agonistic democracy which allows actors to express themselves in languages and utterances that do not necessarily fit the existing regime. And so, but you of course see often also in the context of these conferences of the parties that other people around these conferences express them in their own terms. But I'll go back to that in a sec. So here you see an example that we all know, Rosa Parks in the 1950s. What did she do? She challenged the political, discursively, of course. She said that was about racial inequality. And how did she do it? She exposed the rules by actually not obeying to the rules. And of course, it was meant to reach two different audiences, Americans of color suggesting to also stand up, which happened, and American citizenry at large to think about the social ethics. Is this constitutional that we have such a differentiation amongst different Americans? And so, but the the act that she conducted was not in the parliament, was not in the sort of constitutional politics, it was in a societal domain. Now I go back to environmental politics. And there, now at least 3 of us in this call play a role. So John Robinson has been a lead author in the IPCC. Sybil Seitzinger is a prominent climate scientist in a Canadian scene and beyond. And from the Netherlands with PBL, we also operated in this science policy interface. So what happens is that the science determines or predetermines what the issues are that we need to discuss. And we observe over the past changing climate and most increasing temperatures. We extrapolate then what might happen if we don't change. And then, of course, the suggestion is that there is a need for policy making if we don't want to have disruptions in our societal system. And so the politicians and the policymakers take the framing of the issue from the scientists. So far, so good, and the IPCC is respected, and its media, in the media, always represented in its concerns. But if you look in the details, we constantly have an incredible gap between what the sustainability requirements are, as expressed by scientists, and what then is agreed upon in the political. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Paris Agreement, it says that we have national determined contributions, but what we agreed upon is insufficient to reach the 2-degree target. Moreover, the country contributions at the moment fall short of what was agreed. So it's a double negative. And then thirdly, and that comes from our own academic world, we have given scenarios to underpin the idea that we can reach a 1.5-degree target using technologies that are highly speculative. So negative emissions technology, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it so as to produce more impact later on up to 2050. So there's lots of, let's say there is a large gap. Okay, so that is the context in which we play our role. Now let's then go and look at how that actually works. So here's a bit of an ironic play on my own little role in this. So here is precisely that illustration of that optimism. So we're smiling. This is Achim Steiner on the right. He's the really powerful man and is a senior policymaker of the Netherlands on the left. And in this report that we presented at the conference of the parties, PBL said, well, what you are now about to agree is not going to be enough for what you want to happen. And so at the very moment that we were still negotiating the biodiversity agreement, the academics already said it's not going to be enough. But while the clumsiness of how we have this sort of science policy interface organized comes out in the fact that while the idea was meant to be a discussion so that we could influence the negotiations, the UNEP director, Achim Steiner, had something very urgent on another continent. So instead of that discussion, we had this photo opportunity that suggested that we had that exchange, but in actual fact, we did not have that exchange at all. Now, in the critical social science, we call this summit theater. So the idea that there is a theatricality to it all, where we at least suggest the illusion of being active in something very complicated like climate and biodiversity politics. And these are staged moments to express political concern, but they're not by themselves actively changing things. In a short piece we did in 2015, we call this cockpitism. So the idea that in environmental politics, we work with the notion of governance that in social science, we more or less left. The idea that you can hierarchically order the political and change societal course of events. But that is, of course, then very problematic. But is there then not hope that people at other places correct that notion in the cockpit? Well, what does Greta Thunberg actually say? I want you to listen to the science. So she says, again, we need to listen better to the science. Or what does this vote say? Tell the truth. So the idea that that is about not expressing the truth. Or here, if you see at the top right, do what is necessary. These are sort of activists that all confirm to that scientific definition of the problem in the first place. But now my worry is that scientific expression is all about the state of the environment and the extrapolated consequences of inaction. But it is not, and this is a bit of a preemption already on what I will speak about later on, it is not about what these alternative futures could look like. And therefore, science is constantly providing the political with a negative task to avoid something, not to move to something which might be a better state of affairs. And I'm really disappointed by activists that insist on these tell the truth, do what is necessary, listen to the science as the sort of the critical edge of their contribution to the drama of environmental politics. This is, of course, different. Extinction Rebellion, what they do by lying down in the squares of cities, they do actually what we call enact a grim environmental future. So they lie there because they say we're all going to be worse off, to say the least. So they have a different, they act out another perspective on the future. And what happens if they do that? They are policed. So the disruption of the current state of our cities is not tolerated. What's the intermediate conclusion then? Even activists, in that sort of way in which we conduct our environmental politics, take the science as a starting point. Those who take politics to the street have to count with violence in this particular case. And I think we have to discuss that. If it's realistic to assume that the cockpit and the context that I just sketched is able to deliver on these fundamental social processes of change that we're looking for if you take seriously what we know. So the corridor of the political is too narrow, my argument is, to actually deliver. And I'm interested for us to reflect to what extent we ourselves contribute to the conventions and routines that I find problematic, because that sometimes just happens. It's an assumption that you contribute to a, say, IPCC report in a particular confinement. And what can we do is then the critical academic in me to enhance the ability to recognize when we are actually reproducing the wrong conventions. And of course, then ultimately, how can we be more reflective and think how to use the power of staging of an event to a better effect? Now, if I say these sort of things, it's not as if I do not appreciate the wealth of creativity that we all bring to the fore. And one person that I want to highlight in particular is Johan Roxton. I think he is absolutely unique in constantly finding new ways to try and express the science that is needed, but he sticks to that dramaturgy of showing the science, but he tries to do that in a way that is easier for people to understand. So that's why he invented the planetary boundary scheme, which you see on the top left. Or that was even, you could say, further enhanced by Kate Raworth, who's now a very popular economist. She wrote the book Donut Economics, in which she not only says, well, not only 9 planetary boundaries, but there is also a concern of the social foundation. And that social foundation should be taken also into account. And she says that requires us to rethink the economical. And I think she's very right. And the way she does so is extremely effective. Or this character, Leonardo Dicaprio, I mean, he speaks here on behalf of political leaders in the General Assembly and then presented the flood. And just recently this Christmas, of course, he came up with Don't Look Up. And so all attempts to change the dramaturgy, but all with science and the scientific definition, the natural scientific definition of the issue as its core piece. And so here it was the analogy with a comet, a comet core towards the Earth. And of course, he meant us to think about how we deal with climate change, but it was all about the danger of climate change. It was not about what could we actually envisage as an alternative world in a post-fossil society. Okay, so this is not a very encouraging, and perhaps some people would say, well, a very pessimistic account of our politics, and even including the critics. But that's the nature of the type of discourse analysis I do. So I now try to shift to give you 6 sources of hope, because I'm not negative about our futures if we are able to change the order a bit. And to help you be optimist at the end of this talk, some actually involve change that is already taking place. Now, the first source of hope is complexity. It is undoubtedly so that the Paris Agreement works, not necessarily through the cockpit, but as a discourse. So there are new stages where you see that other actors do something with that Paris Agreement. So here is a very interesting development in the financial world. So the regulators, in this case, the Bank of England, and its governor, Mark Carney, asked all industry, all firms in Great Britain to do a climate stress test, to see to what extent they are exposed to the effects of climate change. And so the logic in the financial world doesn't change, but the risk that climate actually encompasses was reason for the Bank of England to ask all firms to take stock of where their exposure is. And of course, once they become aware, that is a financial risk. It's not whether they are interested in sustainability. It's a risk in their own terms. So it starts to work in that subsystem, as we often would call it. A second element of that complexity as a source of hope is, of course, that the courts have been found to be a stage at which a much more radical climate change policy can occur. So this is the leader of Milieudefensie, a bit Greenpeace type NGO in the Netherlands, who took Shell to court, and the judge said that while the Paris Agreement was an agreement among nation states, firms should also deliver in their own business to help reach these goals. And the lawyers say that this actually will probably be a reason to be taken over in other courts as well. The type of logic holds, and that might mean that actually the courts are a sort of a second stage at which a Paris Agreement becomes effective. The third element of complexity is that sometimes, even though it's not sort of required, people start to have the ambition to leave types of work that are problematic. So start to build with bio-based materials to avoid the CO2 emissions of steel and cement. So in the Netherlands, for instance, you now see that universities, but also housing corporations want to be seen to build with bio-based materials to show how future-oriented they are. So that is a very different effect than that they were ordered by the Paris Agreement or the nation states that had signed it. The second source of hope, the unilateral UN tradition, is of course one that gives unduly power to Saudi Arabia and other countries that do not really want to move quickly to help stop climate change. The alternative is the approach, and there's a long-standing idea, the coalition of the willing. But here it's interesting to note that the new German government actively embraced that notion, the idea that we're no longer going to wait for the slowest and the least ambitious. We will lead by example and turn climate action from cost factor into a competitive advantage. So the argument has been around for a long time, but now we see a leading industrial country arguing this. Now, for the political scientists among you, you're familiar at the top, in the bottom right, with the notion of the California effect. And the research on the California effect holds that if California changes the emission standards for vehicles, or for that matter, if the European Union changed in 1986 the emission standard for vehicles, it has a global effect. Simply because for car manufacturers, it doesn't make sense to produce two types of vehicles. So the toughest standard spreads itself, although it hasn't been agreed upon by all nations, it spreads itself. So that sense, that coalition of the willing argument is indeed a source of hope. If there are a couple of countries, for instance, that would connect their carbon markets, that in itself would make that a much stronger source of newly defined self-interests. A third source of hope is what I call the Big Crocodile Approach. And the Big Crocodile Approach I recommend to all policymakers. If you're new and you come as a minister, you come into your office, you say, tell me what the big crocodiles are. So meaning the big problems, not 100 problems, but a couple that are really, really big. Now, in that sense, and this came also up in the pre-discussion we had, Sybil and Vanessa and I, that you could speak about things like a coal phase out or putting everything on electricity as being in itself moving into the right direction. Take out steel and cement, which account for 15% of global CO2 emissions, or rethink our food system. I mean, this might not be the easiest one, but definitely food is also, both for biodiversity and for climate, incredibly strategic. So you basically focus the policy effort much more on something with a big impact than on the thousand of elements that encompass a complete solution. Also because you assume that once you have the big crocodiles out of the water, the discourse will change and people will, and other domains will follow. Fourthly, and so there's if you add them up, there's quite a bit of reason for hope, is culture. Now, cultural change is not easy, but it's fundamental. And again, if you play the card of culture, you have to do that in the negative and in the positive. So first of all, you have to realize we are in a carbon culture. We live in a culture that is made by carbon, and that also creates our sense of the good life. Having a car, traveling with aeroplanes, having incredible consumption. That's all based on the historical coincidence of having discovered carbon as something that you can burn. But obviously we burn in 150 years what accumulated for 400 million years. So it's completely unsustainable. So, but now we have to move out of that carbon culture into a new culture, a sustainability culture. And is that impossible? Well, it may not be totally impossible, but it requires a very different type of academic work. So the academic work that is in the science policy interface to the predominant dramaturgy is all about natural science, but this would be about thinking of alternative lifestyles, thinking of alternative notions of the good life that people would aspire to. One way to do that, and that's where we in the studio actively think about is to see if you can reveal the absurdity of the present, so that people no longer see that the climate change policies are taking away something of the, which assumes that you have sort of an ideal life, but see the absurdity of the present in your face. So the idea of just pre-packed meat, red meats even in this case, or the type of vehicles that we currently drive. I mean, this is absurd, of course, but SUVs are also slightly absurd if you think why people are using what people are using these vehicles for. So, but that's a strategy to play that cultural card. And another more common and also very prominent one, with lots of potential, is to show attractive images of alternative futures. So here, this is, for instance, a sustainable neighborhood in Sweden, Bone 01. And in a book that we did from the studio, we took stock of a couple of these neighborhoods that more or less achieved what a sustainable world would look like. This sort of environment is not immediately you think, oh, terrible. I mean, this is really the Stone Age. These people must feel awful. Or here, this is a neighborhood in Zurich where they have taken as their starting point that any individual citizen can only use as much energy as would be possible for all citizens in the world to use and still make the Paris Agreement. And that world looks like this. So does it look like hell here? I mean, so the idea that we could perhaps create a much more populist environmental politics by playing the card of what that future life could look like, maybe mobilizing people to a higher extent than trying to force them through the remaining policy regimes. Now, fifthly, constitution. If you realize that the 19th century was when we gave legal rights to firms. The 20th century was the century in which we gave universal suffrage and was the age of social democracy in the sense everybody got access to the political. Why would the 21st century not have a similar big constitutional move? Perhaps it is the century in which we would, in our constitution, give the right for future generations to also have a say, or the right for nature, like rivers with right, which actually is already a practice in New Zealand. So the constitutional sphere is also, the legal constitutional sphere is also a sphere where you can really change the setting for politics. And then finally, what we can do ourselves in the academy. So conscious science. I mean, perhaps shifting from serving the prevailing dramaturgy to developing these enticing images of sustainable futures. 30 minutes, spelling out the pathways to get there together. And 3050.org, I think that's an interesting initiative, because they said, well, if you invest in fossil firms, is that really something that belongs to your image of the responsible future-looking university? So these, in our academy, of course, we have a possibility for change. Now the conclusion then, I'm not belittling the SDGs or their Paris, obviously not, but I see them primarily as having discursive power. So the utterance, the language that expresses our ideals and our new goals, joint goals. But the naive optimism, I think, is really unfounded. The corridors of politics within which we actually have to make policy work against reaching these sustainability goals. And therefore, I can only be hopeful about the future if we would take that next step and actively think of these other stages, how they connect and how they are able to create that new politics of the future, based also on an academy that helps produce these new images of the futures and the pathways to get there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maarten. Fantastic. So in your sense, you're really thinking about the captured futures, capture being that uneven power to determine what is political, what isn't, how politics should be conducted, and that this sense that the main stage is really the climate summits, this place where this discussion is happening, and that science is the language. It might be exactly that capturing that you're mentioning, and even you're showing how the activists are pushing towards the same direction, looking at what's the truth, doing what is necessary, and where hope might lie in terms of shifting that discussion to these other emerging stages, the courts, the banks, the construction world, the coalitions of the willing, focusing on big wins, such as the crocodiles that you mentioned, the role of culture in imagining the absurdity of the present and the amazing images of alternative futures, how this is going to shift our constitution and maybe move us towards the discussion on rights for nature, and this role that the universities and conscious science needs to play in actually being responsible for this dramaturgy. So there's lots to be done in the terms of the discursive power of these existing stages, but perhaps you're encouraging us to look beyond them. And we've already gotten some great comments in the chat and a few questions. Before I go to those, and please continue to add more, I'm actually pleased to welcome our respondent for today, Sybil Seitzinger, who is Professor Sybil Seitzinger, who is the Executive Director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And you're also a professor in the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria. You were the Executive Director of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program that helped all of us see these connections between different parts of science. You're an expert yourself in land, atmosphere, ocean, biogeochemistry, and a focus on the nitrogen cycle that Hank was mentioning as well, and how our humans are affecting it. And you know Maarten really well from interacting with him at Utrecht University and in these international climate discussions. So Sybil, if you can speak to us about what your reflections are on Maarten's presentation and what you think needs to happen as we start to tackle this, as we're tackling this climate emergency. So over to you, Sybil.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you, Maarten, for that very thought-provoking perspective, and for some of our recent discussions, which we've had just in some of the past few days. And you've really opened my eyes and my imagination to context of captured futures, the concept of dramaturgy, and many other things. And, you know, as Maarten well knows, but many of you maybe in the audience don't, I'm not a political scientist by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a physical scientist. I'm a biogeochemist. And so my comments today are going to be a little bit maybe different than Maarten's, but I'm hoping to give you some things to reflect on as well that I think do intersect in many ways to the things that he said. But I'd like to start out by acknowledging first of all, that I'm coming to you from the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And then I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wisanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So I thought I would take a slightly different approach in my comments and talk about two changes or trends that I've seen over the past decade, the last decade of about 4 decades actually of my career, and changes that I've seen that I think are positive, that may help to move things forward, albeit them incremental advances, but also I think quite important ones. And I also want to acknowledge that my discussions over the past couple of days with 2 researchers in residence here at PICS, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, Dr. Hannah Teicher and Dr. Vanessa Lueck have also contributed to some of my comments. But anything that I say that's incorrect, where I put my foot in my mouth, say things that are just not right on, really are attributed to me, not to them. So on with what I wanted to say. I'm going to focus on 2 points. One is on shifting the script from technology, primarily solutions, to the recognition that we really need to also include values. And the second point being lived experience and how in the global north, but I'll really restrict my comments to Canada and the United States, that we've really, in the past several years, very short years, as Henk actually referred to, had some real lived experiences of climate change. And that we've moved from looking at model outputs and scenarios and graphs and maps on paper or on our computer screens of percent changes, this and that, to actually lived experiences of really impactful climate change in very negative ways. So back to my first point, shifting the script. So approaches to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions and for adapting to climate change, as Maarten pointed out, have really primarily been dominated in the past decades by looking at technological approaches. And most model scenarios, not all, but most model scenarios have used technology approaches for achieving greenhouse gas reductions. And that's been followed, of course, by national policies and local policies, really focused on technology. You know, we can pick up on an example of zero emission vehicles. Here in Canada, by 2035, all new light duty vehicles that are sold must be zero emission vehicles. Okay, talking about policies to replace coal-fired electricity with solar or wind or hydro, very low or zero emission. Or another example, building hard infrastructure to deal with sea level rise or climate or storm surges. Instead, looking at other alternatives. But don't get me wrong, of course, technology is important, is a critical important of a component of climate solutions. But I think the script is now shifting to acknowledge the importance of and to include considerations of social values, social context, in addition to technology. And of course, there's a large literature on this, but actually the implementation of it is really, I think, just beginning. I wanted to paraphrase something that I heard at the recent COP. And really relates to effective policy development and implementation. And the quote is that if a policy isn't being adhered to by society, what's wrong with the policy? We often think what's wrong with the technology. No, it's what's wrong with the policy. Also looking at the IPCC reports, which have been referred to, and the recent AR6 Working Group 1 report on the physical climate system. And there's, I think, growing recognition, even in the physical climate system component of the IPCC reports now, of the importance of the social context and values. And I just wanted to read a short paragraph or a few sentences from a report that came out in Nature Climate Change this month, actually, from Carolina Pulkkinen and a number of co-authors. Quote, although the AR6 has opened the door for an open discussion about social values, values are discussed in only 2 chapters, 1 and 10, and did not promulgate into the rest of the report or into the summary for policymakers. This suggests that despite the open acknowledgement of social values in the construction of climate change information, there might be some difficulty in recognizing how this actually occurs. So there's movement forward. Physical climate change component of the AR6 is really starting to more seriously recognize it, but yet actually implementing it and including it in a really meaningful way. We're just at the beginnings of that. Moving now to a more local perspective. At local scales, we're also starting to see more inclusion of values. I'm just going to use an example from PICS and a project that we're funding currently, which is called Living with Water. And I'm using this because I thought it might resonate with the Dutch community here. But Living with Water brings together a diverse, multidisciplinary team to support local and Indigenous communities living in British Columbia's South Coast to prepare for and adapt to sea level rise and increased flooding. And actually, this includes a researcher from the Netherlands, from the University of Wageningen. So bringing a very important perspective to that project. And this project includes 3 municipalities, Surrey, Vancouver, and Squamish, 2 First Nations, and a multiple university faculty and students as well. So Living with Water is integrating community values and Indigenous knowledge and perspectives in coastal flood risk assessment to support alternative flood adaptation solutions, including nature-based solutions, multifunctional dikes, and undoubtedly also some traditional hard infrastructure. So the project is taking the approach of the global decision, is not taking the approach of the global decision-making structure, but bringing together local and traditional values to reimagine and redefine what adaptation governance is. So I'll now move on quickly to my second point, which is really about moving from graphs and model outputs to lived experience. So I think here in Canada, as well as in the United States and many other places, that we thought we were kind of immune from major impacts of climate change, that we weren't really going to have much effect or impact, that the small percentage changes in precipitation that are projected, the few degrees of temperature increase, were not really going to be impacting us in negative ways. But I think in the past few years, we've moved from looking at model outputs and scenarios, graphs and maps on paper or on our screens of the expected impacts to really stark images and lived experiences in our own back doors, some of these of which Henk referred to in his opening remarks. So, for example, who did not smell the smoke from the wildfires, the massive wildfires in 2017 and 2018, and even this past summer, and know people who have lost their homes, who have had severe health effects because of that? Another example, the severe heat dome this past summer in BC. Nearly 600 people lost their lives because of that. Crops were compromised, many other impacts as well. And then again, as Henk referred to, the flooding in the Lower Mainland this fall wiped out whole communities, major highways, livelihoods, disrupted supply chains. So we're really living this experience now. And the question is, how can we use that to wake ourselves up and to use that lived experience to imagine other futures and to create futures that reduce the impact of climate change? And moving from thinking that we're now in a new normal to actually acknowledging that we're going to be continually evolving, the climate is going to be continually evolving, and that we need to be agile and we need to be respectful and we need to plan for those changes in ways that we haven't done before. So the times they are changing, we need to now really include in a much more substantive way the social and human dimensions of technology and policy. And we need to use our lived experience to more effectively address climate change. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I look forward to discussions.
Great. Thanks so much, Sybil. Yes, this recognition of values alongside of technology, as you say, it's not a replacement, but how do we actually bring that in? And not only, a broad breadth of values to local and traditional values, the social human dimensions, and become more agile and respectful and evolving given our local lived experiences. Maarten, when you hear this from Sybil, what are your reflections in terms of these discourses and the shifting discourses that are needed on these new emerging stages?
Well, thanks very much, Vanessa, and also thanks very much, Sybil, of course. I take great encouragement out of what you said, because when we sort of discussed this over the last weeks, what we were going to do, you sort of expressed a concern that without hope and environmental politics couldn't work. And of course, that made me pay more attention to trying to define source of hope. And I think what you mentioned are sort of, again, additional source of hope Probably I would group them, however, under the cultural. So the idea that we are now entering also a phase of environmental politics as a cultural politics, where these values are central. But now comes, of course, the sort of the twist. This is a societal thing. So for policymakers to be active on values is extremely complicated. So we have this long-standing tradition that policymakers and academics, it deals with the facts, and the politicians deal with the values. But to have sort of value-based sustainability scenarios, I mean, then we really have to make it much more political, right? And then we would have to discuss, what sort of future we want. Now, for me, that's a good thing. So the idea that there is one sustainable future that is basically in the negative defined of what we need to avoid by natural science is a vulnerable proposition. I think that we indeed have to sort of turn the page and say we're in a new phase. We know what we need to know. We have seen it in our back doors happening. So now all attention should be about how we want to act upon that sustainability challenge. And then we will get politics revisited. So earlier, Henk said that the new Dutch cabinet has lots of text and lots of money to act upon the sustainability challenge. But here again, there's immediately a concern that we feel from the Sustainability Academy. There seems to be a new sort of discourse of hope around hydrogen, green hydrogen. So that is, as we all know, not an energy source. It's a conveyor of energy that allows you to store energy and to bring energy to cars or to homes, but at a horrendous cost. And of course, that is a political choice. An alternative choice would be, for instance, say perhaps you have to live more modest lives. I'm not necessarily saying that is my choice, but that there is that sustainability has many different solutions, so that we always have to talk about sustainable futures. And that's why we're also called the Urban Futures Studio, plural. And that these different possible futures have to be discussed urgently. That is indeed, and if we can agree upon that is now what we feel is happening, is an entirely different dramaturgy for environmental politics, and requires us to also rethink our institutions. So I'm now a member of an expert team thinking about energy futures for the Netherlands in 2050. It's an expert team. But what happened in that expert team? We said we need to immediately get citizens involved in what we do. We no longer believe that experts can define that future. We have to already, as experts, it's very different than it normally would be, relate to citizens by citizen councils and mini publics and the like. So in that sense, for political scientists, it's a very, very fascinating and demanding period where we also have to rethink our institutions. And I think part of what we should do as academics is see society as our focal point and have therefore developed a science-society interface next to the science policy interface that we know all too well, and that we should, of course, continue stocking with good information.
Great, thank you, Maarten. And actually, this point about the science-society interface was also brought up in the chat by Mapula Shangala. Mapula, you were saying that the other gap that you're seeing is that the science itself is the science policy piece is one gap, but there's also a gap between that and practice, and that a lot of times the way science is produced in the way that you're describing kind of keeps practice, and Sybil, you're speaking to this as well. So a more inclusive science policy practice interface and a more just transition approach offers much more promise, Mapula saying, that I think is worth, us considering. We also have some question around basically a comment from John Robinson, who has had to depart the call for another commitment, but he wrote in the chat that, if we take political dramaturgy seriously, then the climate summit theater is not where we can think of it as being a consequence of socio-particular political circumstances. So they're really, those summits are an indicator of changing context, but he agrees with you, Maarten, that we should look elsewhere for socio-cultural leverage points. And he also liked your discussion of science usually being about projections of undesirable futures rather than explorations of desirable futures. To John, that's a difference between forecasting from today as opposed to backcasting from a vision of what's possible. So putting those 2 points together, he gets a more hopeful message from the first half of your talk than you perhaps feel, because he sees these summits as being an indicator, but that actually we need to look elsewhere and start mapping out these desirable futures. Beth Carruthers has been sharing some of these possible places to look, such as the International Living Futures Institute and Jason McClellan's work, the Land Art Generator that's looking at clean energy at the needs of local communities, and as well at the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure at the University of California at Santa Cruz. So we're taking a look at those, as well as the work of Clean BC as well. And Jeffrey Barber in particular asks you, Maarten, could you identify some examples of authors, filmmakers who've produced narratives of plausible transitions to sustainable futures, to some of these desirable futures?
Perhaps the last question I can refer to Jeroen, who's can easier type than I, while engaging in the discussion. But Jeroen, I'm sure can provide a few examples out of sort of what we often discuss.
Yes, Jeroen, did you want to pop in here and just or write some into the chat, depending on whether or not you've got access to your microphone quickly? Jeroen, examples of, I'll come back to you, Jeroen, about some examples that to answer Jeffrey's question. I'll just go to Andrew Hayden's question here. Maarten, earlier in your academic career, you wrote about ecological modernization, which includes the win-win idea that ecological improvement can go hand in hand with continued economic growth. And that's become a dominant idea of many governments that are taking some environmental action today. Is an ecological modernization discourse part of the problem today, part of that narrowing of the corridor of politics that we need to go beyond? Or do you see a continued relevance for it? Maarten.
No, I think it's increasingly problematic. So there is actually a way in which the combined forces of science and policy making tend to make something really big like climate change into a solution, a problem solution format. So things are made small and then you can find a solution for it. And ecological modernization would then basically say that it need not be difficult because pollution is inefficiency. Yeah? So it's always, you can organize your way out by spotting it as an inefficiency and then become more efficient. But it's actually increasingly difficult to accept because the sheer volume of our demand for resources is such that efficiency politics won't work. So what we thought would work in the 1970s, which was when we defined ecological modernization in its principles, that we then subsequently first experimented with in Japan and in Germany in the 1980s, and then later became sort of dominant discourse also through the OECD think tank work on it, that I think is no longer a valid option. And what Sybil described speaks to that, I think. So that it is now much more about communities coping with the manifest climate change and having to rethink their practice in a much more fundamental way. And if I can give some recommended reading on that, I'm deeply impressed by Amitav Ghosh's latest book, The Nutmeg's Curse, in which he sort of peels layer after layer from environmental politics and gets deeper and deeper into how all sort of elements of our history contributed to that notion of to the sustainability crisis. And so in that sense, it is definitely much more fundamental than just getting rid of inefficiency. In that sense, ecological modernization is not a valid answer to the problems of today.
Great, thank you so much, Maarten. And Jeroen and I were just on the chat together. Of course, the imagining of possible futures is something that we're working also with Jeffrey about, Barbara. And we're going to be, as Maarten was saying, the Ministry for the Future by Kinstanley Robinson is one approach to looking at that topic, but it's something we're going to be working more on and hosting a Cannes event about later in this year. So we'll come back to that as well. I know that some of you are not so familiar with the chat function, so we are going to allow to see if there's anybody who wants to just put their hand up and has a brief question to ask Maarten. If you do have that, you can either use the put your hand up function on the participant on the chat on your reactions piece, or you can also just physically put your hand up once you put your camera on and I can see it. So let me know if there's somebody who would like to just speak directly. And in the meantime, I just want to also raise attention to some of the discussions that happened right at the beginning that, about the role of the municipality and neighborhood scale, for example, reducing car dependency through urban planning, and the role that municipalities can play in shifting the climate, moving towards climate solutions. So a curiosity, some of the participants are also interested in the role of communities. I'm not sure if there's something you can say there, Maarten, about whether or not this captured future politics, or the captured futures of climate politics also extends to the city or municipal scale.
And interesting that we see precisely at that neighborhood scale, we see these initiatives that are more encompassing. But again, it's not the mainstream. So in the Netherlands, for instance, we have a policy which seeks to make neighborhoods natural gas free. But that's just a very thin definition, of course, of sustainability. And so what we with the book try and put on the table is to say, well, think of all the other elements that are not quite as you would like them. So for instance, the fact that there's a lot of loneliness in neighborhoods, the old age people living on their own, not having sort of the public infrastructure to bring them together, that shops are under pressure because of the digitalization of shopping and so forth. So if you think about the neighborhood of the future, there are much more things that need to be addressed. And if you would bring them together, of course, then you can see how they can reinforce themselves in a scenario that is really optimistic about making livable neighborhoods that are much more innovative than merely getting rid of natural gas. Yes? So the bureaucratic logic of chopping up issues, Henk again spoke to that earlier. So nitrogen is different from climate, is different from the circular economy. We understand why a bureaucracy would chop things up and sectoralize, but precisely on the neighborhood, the art is to bring those different sectoral concerns together and have a sort of territory-based approach. And I think that as an alternative logic also allows us to rethink what participation and citizen involvement can then also mean, precisely on that level that people know so well. And neighborhood is where people understand as much about what makes it good as an expert from the outside.
Great, thank you, Maarten. Now we have Jean Boucher's got a question to ask, and then I'll ask Tim's question from the chat as well as before we wrap up. So over to you, Jean.
Hi, Maarten. Thanks, Vanessa. I really enjoyed your presentation, Maarten, especially your attention to detail and complexity of the issue. I guess it's the clarifying question. You offered a critique, and maybe you explained this and I missed it. You offered a critique of a sort of listen to the science, sort of that narrative, I guess. And is your critique that there's more going on than just listening to the science? Like, what about the political inertia, path dependency of politicians? Is that sort of your critique? Thanks.
Thanks, John, for your question. No, well, the listen to the science is so biased to a particular sort of science, and that's not the pathway type of science that I would like to have in the center. And the pathway type of science is where the natural sciences collaborate with social scientists to define scenarios that are worth living, that also aspirational futures for people. So it is a negative call about listening to the science, and it's the prophecy of doom that then has to have its political effect. If we do not act, then, you know, etc. And I'm disappointed by that type of call upon the science. And so if we would do more what Sybil also suggested is already happening in Canada, actually what we get into is what we call a transdisciplinary type of science, where in trying to find a definition for communities to move on, they will come up with scientific questions that we would use as academics as our starting point, right? We would have to help them to redefine the business case. Okay, what is a farm without the nitrogen flow off that they, you know, are accustomed to because they use fertilizer all the time? Right? So they can't be expected to define these business cases or us. We need agricultural economics to help them, you know, make money and make a living. So it's a very different interaction between science and society.
Great, thank you, Maarten. And so Tim's got a question just about whether, you know, and just want to, before I go to Tim, I just want to mention a few points that Jeroen made about places to look for alternative futures. So Kim Stanley Robinson's earlier Science in the Capital, sci-fi, for inspiring examples such as Ursula Le Guin's Hainish Universe and several books. For Futures, Life After Capitalism is also very interesting, and not necessarily but a sustainable future, but The Overstory by Richard Powers. So just some other ideas for those watching the webinar, can't see the chat. So Tim Cronshaw asks, is economic degrowth now unavoidable? If so, what does this imply for the stability of existing institutions, or are we looking at a discontinuity? So to answer that, I'm going to actually ask Maarten to start us off, then I'll go to Sybil, end with you, Henk. Is this a moment of discontinuity? Just a couple of remarks from each of you before we close. So over to you, Maarten first, then Sybil, then Henk. Is this a moment of discontinuity? Go ahead, Maarten.
Yes, I would think it is a moment of discontinuity, but it's the continuation of environmental politics in a different setting, in a different dramaturgy. If that is my pitch. And so it is not about disruption and society amnesia. It is about redefining how we do and who conducts environmental politics, and whether or not that is degrowth. I mean, so degrowth has a particular connotation, but I mean, even in the center of politics at the moment, we're discussing a redefinition of economic parameters. And so well-being as being a core value that is higher than, say, gross domestic product as an indicator of how well the economy is doing. I mean, that's no longer at the edges of the political, that's in the center. But we still have to readjust the models that we use to, you know, to say how well we are doing, to take account of these much more profound understandings of what the economy is for and how to measure that.
Right, thanks, Maarten. Sybil, to you.
On one hand, I'd say I hope this is a moment of discontinuity, but discontinuity in a constructive way. I think that I hope that it's a period of time of awakening of the North. I also hope that it's a time of continued or a major step change in acknowledging and helping those who are not able to deal with the massive climate change now and before us, and take on that responsibility in a much more serious way. And that there will always be continued incremental changes, but we also need some massive step changes.
Great. And of course, Sybil, you also mentioned when we spoke before about the critical role of education and especially K to 12, the young people, building the awareness and climate literacy and understanding of this new world as it's emerging.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sybil. Hank, to you.
I'm far less intellectually schooled a person here at the table to say no to a discontinuity or yes to a discontinuity. But let me give two observations in my recent work here that gave me a little bit of hope, which sums up to the hopes that Maarten brought us. Thank you, Maarten, for giving us this image, and Sybil, to you too. I was a bit relieved by the way Maarten looks at things, as I was in the past also as a policymaker now and then. The doom of climate is now and then so harsh also for, I'm a consul general, but also bringing my garbage to the street on Thursday. And so sometimes as a citizen, you feel so overwhelmed by the huge things that are sketched by science that indeed sometimes there's a kind of idea. Let's put your head, or I'll put my head a little bit under the water so that I don't hear it, because it's difficult. And I think I see that a lot in my environment. So I think it's helpful to have this kind of rediscussing our perspective. But one thing I wanted to mention is 2 months ago I had here in my house. I brought together some policymakers and also 15 CEOs of clean tech firms in BC. So I was talking to, at the table there were people, let's say, from carbon engineering companies working at carbon usage and storage. There was the CEO of a company working on energy, on fusion energy for the future. There was a CEO working in the ag tech world, working on using less insecticides in the agricultural business. And what struck me, that although I was sitting with, let's say, the starting big capital at the table, it was companies at the table. The discussion never went about short-term profit and revenues in these new upcoming companies. They all saw a future where they saw new business models coming up that could also help us in reaching climate goals. And I'm telling this because I'm not trying to emphasize the role of technology in climate policy, but let's say young people thinking about new business models that can make profitable companies, but also can bring something to our future, which is very helpful. Second thing I wanted to say is that Maarten has a Dutch background, and the Dutch politics is a little bit different from, in my opinion, from BC politics. We here in BC have, let's say, more the two-party system, conservatives versus liberals. But what you also see much more in, it's my opinion here in Vancouver in BC, is a very local community-based kind of talks about politics. It's less much influenced by the large energy numbers, and much more also about what people can do in their own environment and how they can help each other. I'm a member of a small app in which you have talks with neighbors, and everybody's talking about where can I bring this garbage? What can I do with that? Can you help me with that? There's a great social fabric in this city that can help us also very much into in the big themes that Maarten is sketching. And I hope that that kind of politics will also find its way back into the Netherlands, because it's hopeful and you need it, I think. So that's from my side, Vanessa.
Great, thank you so much, Henk. So yeah, this promise that lies in how people in business are looking at this differently and community are looking at this differently. A big thank you to Maarten, to Sybil, to Henk for this exploration today of the evolving environmental politics in theater and the hope that lies in approaching this as a cultural challenge as well. Now, this webinar has been recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel for CANS Vancouver, which is the producer of this event today, in partnership with the Consul General of the Netherlands in Vancouver, with my nonprofit One Earth and the Wild Bird Trust of British Columbia. And we're going to actually continue this climate series on Wednesday, the 16th of February at 11:30 in the morning, Vancouver time, with interviews with two climate innovators, Dr. Sanli Fayez, who's picking up on Maarten's challenge around the future of the university and also how will science save us, and Lynn Zabeda, who's going to be speaking about the Church of Climate Change and an inclusive transition to a sustainable and climate-friendly future. Erwin, could you speak to the events in March connected to World Water Day as we wrap this up? Erwin Ostend is also a board member here with CANS Vancouver with the Wild Bird Trust of BC. Go ahead, Erwin.
Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, and so we have events coming up in March. March the 16th will be a special event for World Water Day. It'll be a brown bag lunch event. So 11:30 in the morning from the Tuesday, the 22nd, and then Saturday, the 26th, will be a science day for families out at Maplewood Flats in North Vancouver, involved with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. We'll be presenting, Sybil mentioned the Living with Water project. We'll have researchers presenting on that, as well as walks, learning about native plants and learning about our own local ecosystem here. So looking at, as Vanessa, you mentioned earlier on about the role of Indigenous leadership as well, Indigenous knowledge, and the critical role that that's going to be playing in our futures. So that's presentations from the Wild Bird Trust of BC. And of course, these issues affect bird populations, our ecosystems. There's huge questions about Roberts Bank 2 and the kind of unrelenting impacts in the region here. I know Maarten has thoughts on the port cities of Rotterdam and how the ecosystems are being protected there. So I think the Port of Vancouver could also learn some things from Rotterdam and Dutch knowledge around how to protect ecosystems and how to find that balance. So March the 22nd and March the 26th, and folks who've been registered for today will automatically be invited to attend those events.
Great. Thank you so much, Erwin. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us today on Sunday, the 23rd of January on Dutch Perspectives on the Climate Series. Again, thank you, Maarten, Sybil, and Henk. And we look forward to you joining us next time as well. Have a great rest of your evening or morning or day. And until soon again. Thank you from all of us.
Thanks, everybody.